that you're running? How do you pass it on? What types of things do you need to protect from maybe long-term care expenses or family disputes, things like that. So there's a lot of different things you need to think about, though, when you are planning to pass on a farm to the next generation. And so that's a specific area that we focus on. Well, welcome everybody. I'm attorney Justin Randall with Hooper Law Office. Today our topic is farm planning, or if you saw our pun title, our LegenDAIRY farm planning. We like to joke here, but just a reminder, if you are participating via Zoom, there is a Q&A function. So if you see the Q&A box and you have any questions or anything like that as I'm going through it, this area can be complex. There's a lot of different moving parts. So please feel free to submit a question. I can see it come up, so I'll try to answer it live while we're doing this. And then also, if you pre-registered, you'll be getting a handout from us. It's what we call our 70% dilemma sheet, which the idea behind that is, well, 70% of farms, family-owned businesses that try to pass on to the next generation do not successfully do so, or maybe pass on initially, but then do not continue to be successful after that point. So there's a lot of things that you can do to prepare for that and try to give the next generation and your family the biggest chance of success for that running the farm or businesses in general, but it particularly will pertain to farms. So part of what we talk about a lot with, why are there reasons to plan when you have a farm? Why not just pass it on to the next generation, through a will, or just let it pass, with whether it's like a transfer on death deed or something like that? Why do you need more complex planning? And the issue really comes down to, there is a lot of moving parts with a farm, right? It's not just land. It's not just your home. It's your business. It's your lifestyle. There's a lot more of it, land, than, a traditional estate, perhaps. There's a lot of business considerations as well, tax considerations, possible debt considerations that you have. So there's a lot more you need to be aware of. And so just doing nothing often is guaranteeing that either it's going to be incredibly hard to be successful on the next generation, or it's just doomed to fail. So proper planning, even doing it years in advance and setting that structure up, really gives the next generation and your farm the chance of succeeding that it deserves. So one of the things to I'm going to try to run through this sort of start to finish of how you would maybe plan around a farm. So, first and foremost is, how do you operate your farm currently, right? Do you own it as an LLC? Are you a sole proprietor? What's the business structure that you own your farm through? The issue a lot of people create accidentally is if they don't make a big distinction between themselves as the individual, I own this land, I live on this property, and the business of the farm itself. So for a lot of liability reasons, you may want to look at setting up a business entity if you don't have one, and choosing the right one for you can be difficult if you don't know, you don't have a background in it, you don't understand the difference between various entities. And believe me, they can be nuanced, and there's, certain reasons you might go with, for say, an LLC over, an S corp or a sole proprietorship or a partnership, family partnership, all of those types of things. So a very common one we see is having a farm owned as an LLC. That is a limited liability company. So it's what we would call a pass-through company, meaning that it, any income generated, any losses generated pass through to the owners themselves. So it's not like it's being taxed as a corporation, for example. One thing to be very aware of when you're doing planning around business structures, especially with farms, is if you do own the business structure as a corporation, whether it's a C corporation or an S corporation, you do want to make sure that you do not have the land passed to the next generation being owned by that corporation. So just because you run your business as a corporation does not mean that that corporation has to own the land itself. And the reason for that is when a corporation passes to the next generation, that land which is the bulk of the assets around the farm, do not get step up in cost basis. So when an individual owner or a pass-through entity owns land, that land gets what a cost basis is essentially, think of it as, well, here's what I paid for the land, or what it passed to me, or what it was worth when it passed to me through my parents' estate plan. That's my cost basis. And then when I sell it, any gain based off of that is, or taxable gain from that sale is based off of the difference between what I sold it for and what my cost basis was in it. So it's really important then for passing it on to the next generation that you make sure your kids have the best tax situation coming into it. And when you pass away, owning that land as an individual or as a pass-through entity, you get an adjustment up to fair market value, whatever it is at the date of your death. And obviously with farmland, that can be incredibly valuable because cost seems to continue to go up for a lot of, per acre farmland. There's usually a lot of acreage. So there's things like that, that's a lot of value that you can potentially give your kids the best tax situation possible, especially if they are just planning on selling the land. If you know they're not going to want to continue and you really do just want to give them the best tax situation, having them have come into a tax situation with, hey, my cost basis is fair market value. What that means then is if I sell it immediately for fair market value or relatively closely in time for fair market value, I don't have to pay any capital gains tax on it at all. So it can be really beneficial to pass it through, whether it's a pass-through entity like an LLC or a partnership, or just individually owned. With C corporations and S corporations, corporations do not get that step up in cost basis for the property that it owns. Shares in the corporation do, but that's not the same result, right? The tax on the land is still going to be there, and it could potentially result in double taxation if they sell the land and then sell the corporation as well. So you want to be very careful about that. And you also, it's not to say you can't own the farm as a corporation, but you might also have like an LLC own the land and the corporation possibly rent from it. So that's an option as well. So I won't bore you too much with business planning around that. I mean, it's just to show that you do want to have the company owned properly or the land owned properly when you are running your farm as a business. The big reason you often want some sort of business to own it rather than yourself is for liability reasons. With a limited liability company, things like that, you're trying to protect your other assets from the liability of the business, right? So if you just run everything as a sole proprietorship, and if you don't have like a business account for the farm and you're just using your personal bank account for all expenses and operating income and losses and all of that, you could potentially open yourself up as an individual to liabilities of the business because there's no real distinction between you and the business then. So that LLC, as long as it is set up properly and you have a business account for it, a bank account that is, and you're running things through it separately from yourself, that makes sure that you can, if any sort of liability ever came up where the farm ownership was getting sued or somebody was injured or there's any sort of lawsuit really, you can say, well, I am not this business is separate from me, so the liability only extends to what is owned by that company, not to my own personal bank account, my own personal retirement and all of that. So there's just liability protection that, hopefully these things never come up for people, right? But sometimes they do. People get sued for all sorts of reasons, some of them legitimate, some of them, ridiculous. So it's just important to protect yourself. But once you have that structure in place, the question becomes, okay, well, how do I pass this on? What's the most efficient way to do this? What do I need to be aware of when I am passing things, especially a farm, but really any business, to the next generation? The first step I always recommend people, take is, if you haven't had this discussion with your kids or your family members, or, say it's somebody you've sort of selected as a successor, whether they're in your family or not, if you haven't had the discussion with them of whether this is what they want or how do they see this going, talking it through ahead of time really can help you get that good starting point of how do I, what type of plan do we even need? Where do we go from here? Because how you see it transitioning might not be how they see it transitioning. And being on the same page with this sort of transition is incredibly important, because if you don't get on that same page right away, you could spend many months putting a plan together that's really well crafted and meets all of your expectations, but then the new ownership or the future ownership doesn't want to sign on to it because it's not what they saw happening, and they get upset about that. Especially when this is a family situation. I mean, a goal of any sort of estate planning, but in particular when you're passing on a family businesses, you don't want to cause strife where there doesn't need to be any. You want to avoid it as much as possible. You want to keep the family together. The point of passing these things on is not to tear your family apart or create any sort of hard feelings. It's to keep the family together. So that discussion is always a good starting point. I know that makes me sound a little bit like a counselor in that sense, and different from a legal counselor, but it really is important, is to have that discussion. So we often start it with a family meeting, and we'll often actually sit the different, the parents down and the kids down in a different room. And myself and Sarah Kahn's another attorney in our office who specializes in this area. She really does. We sit down and we ask each individual person, well, what do you see happening? And then we compare and see where things match and where they don't. And that can really give us a good way to smooth out any sort of disputes before they come up, because you just don't know, if you're afraid to sit down with your family, what somebody might be expecting out of this. And a big part of that often comes down to what people see happening versus what is expected on the child side or on the parent side, for various reasons. Is how does that ownership pass? Is it, if you have two kids, does that ownership pass equally? Or does it pass more to one or all to one of those two children? And you can put any number of kids in there, and the question still applies. People often immediately go to, well, I want it to be equal, right? I want it to be every child gets, an equal share of everything that I'm passing on. But especially when it comes to a business, and particularly farms, fair and equal are not the same thing. There's a lot of times we've seen families where one child has put a lot more work into the farm, has stayed around, has, it's become their life as well. And the other child maybe didn't want to continue that family business, or went off and left the farm and went to work on their own and start their own farm. So, equal in terms of that would be, well, they each get equal shares, but maybe it makes a lot more sense for the person who's put a lot of sweat equity in, possibly some of their own finances, a lot of their own life and time into that farm. It might make sense for them to get more or all of it. It doesn't necessarily make sense to have it equal every time. And I'm not saying you absolutely have to give it all to one kid over another. It really depends on your situation. So don't get stuck on thinking, well, this is what's fair versus this is what, or this is what's equal, so that's what is fair. They're not the same thing, especially when it comes to businesses. If both kids in this scenario work on the farm regularly and are, both responsible and are both putting in the time, effort, money, interest in continuing the farm, then absolutely, maybe that is what's fair at that point. But don't get stuck on fair and equal being or the same thing at all. So, and this can be a big kind of contentious point for people. I've seen families before where the parents really did want it to be equal in all sense, and one of the children had sort of not been around or not really put in the effort and done something else, and then all of a sudden wanted it to be equal. And for the brother who had stuck around, that was a huge problem, because it didn't seem fair that son had put so much time and effort into it and the other had, in the eyes of the brother, not. Whether or not that was actually the case, it's hard to really say, not having been a part of that family myself, but it just goes to show you, that can be that driving wedge between somebody, and that's never the goal for this type of thing. Another thing that people, especially with farms, often overlook when it comes to passing things on to the next generation is the feasibility of passing on, the debt versus the equity of the farm. A lot of farmers do run pretty high, debt to equity ratios. So it's important to have a plan for how to deal with that. Because if for any reason the next generation can't take on that debt because they already have liabilities of their own, and it would not be, a good idea for that to happen, or they don't want to take on that debt, or they're not aware of that debt, anything that could pause that transition because it's not good for them to take on all of that extra debt, that kind of thing is often what stops a plan in its tracks as well, because somebody will say, well, oh my gosh, I didn't realize how much debt the farm had, or, I have no idea how I'm going to pay for all of that. It can also be a driving wedge between a child and their spouse. Maybe the spouse is saying, we're not taking on that level of debt. So having a plan for how to deal with that, starting, payment plans, during your lifetime, or how to transition it more gradually so that, they can take on the debt, but still have some income to deal with things. I mean, those types of things are very important to look at as well. There's a lot of situations where the kids just say, oh my gosh, I can't imagine taking on that. And sometimes, no matter what type of plan you do, no matter how well intentioned somebody is behind something, it may be that the next generation just isn't prepared to do it, or isn't prepared to operate the farm, or isn't what they want to do. And so that does happen. And it's always unfortunate because, you want to pass on your farm. You want that next generation to sort of carry on the legacy there, but it's not always what's right for them either. But what you don't want to have happen in particular is them be interested in it, but then not see a feasible path forward to success. Because if all they see is this mountain of debt potentially, and no rational or logical way in their mind anyway to pay it off or to survive and thrive themselves, it can cause people to get afraid and back out. And it's not an unreasonable fear either. I mean, a lot of farms do run pretty high lines of credit and things like that. So high value lines of credit, that is. So planning for that debt is very important. One of the biggest things that we see a lot of farmers not necessarily think about, just because it doesn't, it's not their area of focus generally, is what happens if long-term care becomes an issue. So long-term care meaning, assisted living, skilled nursing facilities, things like that. A lot of farm families I talk to say, that's never going to happen to me. I'm going to live at home or keep working until I die, that kind of thing. And that's, a very admirable effort to try to do that, I suppose, but it's just not what happens for most people. Most people do at some point need some level of care. It might be temporary, it might not be long-term, but to not be prepared for it is the biggest mistake someone can make, because being prepared for it and having it not happen, not need that level of care, at least you were prepared in case it happened. But not being prepared at all and then having it happen means you are basically scrambling to save what you can at that point, or you spend down all the way. When we're talking about long-term care, it can be very expensive, right? It can be assisted living in the neighborhood of, $5,000 to $6,000 a month on kind of the lower end, up to about $9,000 a month if it's memory care. Skilled nursing, where someone needs just round-the-clock attention and care, is generally more like $10,000 to $11,000 a month. And that's not a national average by any means. That's, here in Wisconsin and in the Fox Valley area, for example, that's what we see. So it's expensive, and you're looking at then potentially, $70,000 to $120,000 a year, right, from that range. And a lot of people, not just farmers, but a lot of people don't have the retirement income to cover that expense without significantly dipping into assets to pay for it. And this is not something that Medicare covers. Medicaid is the program that deals with long-term stays at long-term care facilities. Medicare stops covering after 100 days. So it's important to, be aware of which program is covering which there too, but also making sure that, hey, if this happens to me, I have a way to preserve some of my assets to supplement my care if need be. But in particular, if your goal is to pass on the family farm, you want to protect that land. And this is where farmers are in a unique position, and not necessarily one that helpful for long-term care because of the way that assets are held is it's very land rich, right? You could have a $2 million estate, but it's all tied to the land. So how do you pay for care? What's your income going to look like if you can't operate the farm anymore? What assets do you have in savings outside of the land to pay for those very expensive care options? Well, if you don't have that option, what it comes down to is if you ever need Medicaid's going to say that you have way too much in assets for us to cover you, even though that is land assets. You are not allowed to keep all of this value. It's too much. So they may force you to sell, or they'll place a lien on it, which if you already have some debt on the farm, it just means there's more being added to it. And it may prevent it from being passed on to the next generation because either the kids find a way to pay off Medicaid after you've passed, they pay off what's known as estate recovery, or or they say we can't and we have to sell it, and they still have to pay that money back. So protecting the land in particular from long-term care expenses, is really important for farm families because they don't have a lot of on-hand cash assets to pay for those expenses. So, they may be sort of cash poor, if you will, where they need to dip into the assets of the farm in order to help or, sell the family farm, which is obviously not the goal for most farmers. So it's really important to look at, well, how do we protect that land? How do we stop it from being eaten up by those expenses? Or how do we stop it from, from us having to sell it, or from a lien being placed on it if we need long-term care? And there's a lot of planning you can do in advance. Ideally, any sort of long-term care planning you're looking at doing, you want to do with, roughly 4 to 5 years on average before you even would need care of any kind. Medicaid has a 5-year look back period. So anything you try to protect or you gift to the kids or anything like that, and you don't sell for fair market value, they will give you a penalty for that transfer. So after you've made it out 5 years, they don't request any further back than that, and they can't request any further back than that. But if 4 years ago I gave away the whole farm to my son, and then I applied for Medicaid today, they would be able to see that transfer, and I would get a pretty significant penalty for doing that. And it's not a cash penalty. It's not, they don't force you to pay it back necessarily. It's not pay Medicaid a fine for doing it. It's Medicaid will not cover your care for a certain period of months based off of the value of what you gave away. So, with farm land in particular, that could be very high value. You could have potentially a maximum penalty, and Medicaid's maximum penalty is a 5-year penalty. So it's important to be aware of that. So protecting in advance is very important. Making sure that you talk to an elder law estate planning attorney if you have those concerns about long-term care and protecting it for the next generation, so that you don't have to sell the farm or you don't have to have an extra lien placed on it, can be very helpful. And there's no exact age where this is where you want to start doing this, right? It's really, when do you have the concern, and when do you really think that, hey, I may not have 5 years if I get to X age, right? And what I always sort of jokingly, but also seriously tell people is, as we get older, 5 years becomes less and less likely, right? I mean, I am at age 35, I'm very likely to have many years before I need care. But at age 55 or 65, rather, 55 would still be a little young, but at 65 or 70, 5 years is a little less certain. People have health events at ages that may lead to long-term care, and it would really hurt the farm not to have done that protection planning so that they don't have to use it all up on their care before, especially if they're planning on passing it on to the next generation. So these are not, this or that planning. It's not, hey, you either do business planning and succession planning for the farm, or you don't, or you do long-term care planning, rather. It's not long-term care or business succession planning or anything like that. It's often a mixture of the both. Those two areas in particular, because you do want to make sure that the business structure of the farm is very well situated for the next generation, that you're giving the next generation the best chance at success they can possibly have. Running a business of any kind is very hard, but farms in particular, there's a lot of moving parts, right? There's a lot of, kind of loaning against the farm in order until you get the milk check or you get the crop sold that year. I mean, those types of things can, leave people with fear that they're not going to have income if they don't see that path forward. So setting that path up in advance and talking it through with the next generation is very important. But also protecting it from your own liabilities like long-term care, potential, divorce situations, things like that can be important too. You want to plan ahead for all of those things and with all of those various areas of law. And one of the things that with farm planning in particular always strikes me as different, even though they are businesses often, right? They're owned as an LLC or they're owned as a sole proprietorship, and that is where you're getting your source of your living from. But the difference between a farm and a lot of other areas of business are, businesses can move, right? Businesses can change the building they're in. They can move cities, even they can move headquarters. And it doesn't really matter if that happens. I mean, you might really like the location of a building, but it's not going to be the death of that business to do that necessarily. Whereas with farms, yes, it is a business. And in theory, you could have a corporation, own this plot of land and that's one, sub farm of that corporation. But if it is your farm, if it's your land that has been in your family for generations, if it's passed on from grandparents, great grandparents, if you want that to continue, that land is essential, not just the business. So doing this planning in advance to make sure that land that is your farm is passed down properly and gives your children, and I keep saying children, but in reality, it could be anybody that you're planning to pass the farm to. You want to make sure that they give, the best chance of success to the next generation. One thing, last thing I'll leave you with, because I'm running a little short on time, is, I keep talking about the next generation like they have to be your kids or something like that. And that may not be the case, right? As I mentioned, some people just don't want to continue in a family business, whether it's a farm, whether it's, running a deli or a restaurant, whatever it is. People often have their own goals too. So if it is not your wish to pass it on to the next generation of your family, or they don't want to, and you're aware of that and have accepted it, that, they don't want to take it over. One thing to consider as well is if you are planning on selling it is working on, a business plan to maximize the value of things and make it very appealing to potential buyers and things like that. So that once, you do sell it, you're still leaving your children with, or yourselves, if you sell it during your lifetime, you're leaving yourselves or your children with the best value, that you've accrued over all of the years of hard work that you've done on the farm. So it's whether it's selling it during your lifetime or having your kids sell it after you're gone, or it's, I want to make sure this business continues in the family, the farm continues on. There's the planning goals are different in that instance, but they are, both equally as essential to do. It just depends on what your goals are. So if you have any desire to talk about this is something we do. And in particular, what I'll point you to is we do have a feedback form for this webinar. It, asks you certain questions like, hey, any topics you'd like us to talk about, things like that. But if you would like us to reach out and set up an initial consultation, we don't charge for those consultations. They're free, complimentary. And we schedule them for about 2 hours. Although for this type of planning, I would budget a little longer than that because there's a lot that we need to go through. And part of the reason we set aside so much time for it is because we really want to make sure that we know your family and we know your situation. And that includes looking over a lot of the information on the farm and getting to know you as much as it does, hey, here's the documents you need, right? That's only an aspect of the plan. That's not the plan itself. So we really like to set aside time to really know your situation. So if that's something you're interested in at all, we would encourage you to fill out those forms and say you would like us to reach out to you. If you do so, it'll be likely that you'll be meeting with myself and Sarah Kahns, who is a partner here. And we will look forward to seeing you if you guys need any assistance with that. And before I let you go, I'll say our next topic here is because our last topic was about personal representatives and dealing with probate. We had so many good questions during it that there's still so much information to cover that we decided to do a follow-up for it and make sure that you could ask more questions if you have any, if you're named as a personal representative. So that is February 3rd at noon. And I look forward to seeing you guys then.